Halo Wars is a real-time strategy game that was released on March 3rd, 2009. This game was based on the critically acclaimed Halo games, but was met with mixed player feedback. I was 8 years old when I played this, and this was one of the many early games that I played, such as Burnout 2, Most Wanted, and various others. I found a lot of joy when playing through this game then, and so I wanted to revisit it, but with a twist. Our very own Halo Wars challenge. Let's jump straight into the rules. I'm only able to use infantry only. This means soldier-based units such as Marines, flamethrowers, Spartans, etc. Branching off of that is that if I'm given non-infantry units at the start or throughout the level, I must sacrifice them. Upgrades and player powers are allowed, and I will talk about these more throughout the run, but want to briefly mention them here. Next, the game's difficulty will be on Legendary, meaning the hardest difficulty. Subsequently, I am allowed to use skulls. These are modifiers to the campaign that allow the player access to bonuses or hindrances. Skilled Fawn, you don't need skulls to beat this challenge. Well, I will explain more of this later, and then I will let you be the judge of that. Afterwards, I must beat the game. There are over 10 plus missions that range from 10 minutes to over an hour to complete. Lastly, glitches and or exploits are allowed, so expect me to take full advantage of my arsenal. I'm really excited to share this challenge with you guys since I haven't played this game in a bit and never attempted a challenge run before on this. Make sure to smash the like button, comment, and subscribe to help support me and the channel. Without further ado, let's get into the run. The first mission of the game, Alpha Base, is designed to teach the basics of unit movement and combat, but with the legendary difficulty and infantry only rule, it became a much more intense experience. The mission starts with Forge, but unfortunately he isn't a Warthog. One good thing about Forge is that he can be used as an infantry unit after his Warthog is destroyed. I sent him straight into enemy territory where he inevitably fell. Afterwards he can be continually revived, which works out well for us. As the player progresses throughout the level, they will find various UNSC troops in combat. Since some of them were in Warthogs, I immediately sacrificed them by driving them straight into enemy fire. It did feel wasteful, but rules are rules, and from here, the challenge truly began. Armed with only a limited number of Marines, the first task was clearing the Covenant from the area to secure Alpha Base. On Legendary, even the smallest encounters can punish you. The elites guarding the base hit hard, and there were a few wraiths that were a serious obstacle. The key was to focus fire on individual targets to break through their defenses quickly. Grenades were valuable here, but using them carelessly could leave my squads vulnerable during cooldowns. Once the base was secured, the mission ended. Playing through the game's first mission, it was already clear that the challenge on Legendary would require methodical and calculated decisions every step of the way. Before we get into the next mission, I want to quickly talk about the cutscenes in this game. Easily one of the better aspects of this game, I have to say that the cutscenes go so hard even to this day. If I could have a Halo show with a similar direction to all the cutscenes in this game, instead of what we got in the live action one, I would take that in a heartbeat. Now, Halo Wars' story is definitely not the best, and at times is rather weak or doesn't know what to do with itself. Regardless, the cutscenes go super hard, and I will definitely talk about this more during the video. Relic Approach introduced heavier Covenant forces. The objective was to escort troops to the Relic site while fending off Covenant attacks along the way. With no vehicles allowed, my infantry had to do some heavy lifting against enemy armor. In this mission, we are given near full access to the base's abilities. Now have the Flamethrower Infantry unit. To explain, the player can find various base build locations throughout the campaign. Once built, the player can place barracks, turrets, reactors, and other buildings that will help them in their conquest. Within some of these buildings, troops, vehicles, etc. can be purchased. Since we are doing infantry only, I am forced to only use the barracks. Most classes of troops can be upgraded for additional damage and other effects. The flamethrowers, for instance, can be upgraded so that they can flashbang enemies too. There are plenty of other examples that I will talk about and showcase throughout the video. One of the toughest parts of this mission was keeping squads alive. Since infantry are weaker compared to vehicles and air units, this required careful positioning and frequent use of healing powers. The Covenant kept the pressure on with reinforcements, so it was a constant battle. Eventually, we reached the Relic and secured the site, though not without some heavy losses. In Relic Interior, the mission focuses on navigating tight corridors while fighting Covenant forces along the way. Forge and Anders were investigating the Relic when Covenant forces ambush them and are forcing them into a firefight. With this mission, the game unfortunately forces the player to use grizzly tanks, so yeah. We did go through and beat it, but it was still slightly frustrating that there was no workaround for Infantry Only. Arcadia City was a major step up in difficulty, and that is a massive understatement. The goal was to evacuate civilians while holding off relentless Covenant assaults. The map is large with multiple transports to protect as Covenant forces attack from every direction. This is also the mission in which the player is introduced to Spartan troops, and once again the cutscene goes super hard. Unfortunately, we aren't able to command any of them just yet, but they will help in the background. The main challenge here was dealing with the Covenant's large array of units, specifically the Wraiths, Locusts, and Banshees. Without access to vehicles and air units, my Marines had to rely purely on their anti-air capabilities. But this wasn't enough to stop the constant waves. I had to keep moving my forces to intercept threats before they reached the civilians, which made it hard to establish a solid defense. Thankfully, the player is given access to orbital drop shock troopers, or more commonly known as ODSTs, to help in this mission. The downside is that the player has to upgrade the Marines all the way up to ODSTs, which is thousands of credits and at least 2+ minutes worth of just research time. I ended up having to restart this mission over and over again for a few reasons. First is the previous talking point about the Covenant forces. Since I'm using infantry only, it is harder to counter the stronger health opponents. Second is that the Covenant have a strong presence already before starting, so that the player is thrown face first into danger. Thirdly is that the Covenant has 2 bases and a super cannon that can fire on any target regardless of the distance. This combination led to the mission being extremely difficult, a major jump compared to the other missions. Because of this, I need to adapt to overcome this obstacle. At first, I was only protecting the second transport, since the third always takes off around the 17-minute mark, regardless of what the player does. This was both good and bad, but mostly bad. It did help that I didn't need to split my forces, but then would come in super hard to this transport. So I split my forces with transport 1 and 2. Flamethrowers were practically ineffective in this mission, since there were more vehicles and air units rather than troops. Because of that, Marines were the obvious choice, and that meant they were able to deal with the Banshees and Vampires. Placement of troops was critical, and I couldn't mess up, as the Covenant AI on Legendary would easily exploit any gaps in my defenses. After many attempts, the civilians were evacuated and the mission was complete. This was the first mission where it felt like I was really up against a wall, constantly struggling to keep up with the Covenant's relentless attacks. The mission pushed my defense tactics to the limit and prepared me for even greater challenges to come. Thankfully it's over, but this was far from the toughest mission. The objective was to defend an evacuation zone against waves of Covenant forces, and eventually push the Covenant out of the zone. This mission felt like a war of attrition, with the Covenant sending wave after wave of infantry and vehicles, though not as punishing as the previous mission. The mission started with limited resources and troops, and no bases, so I had to build everything from the ground up. Training my infantry force while holding off the initial attacks was a balancing act. I had to prioritize upgrading my Marines early to ensure they could handle the increasing difficulty of the waves. A highlight of this mission was that at one point the player is given access to, I think, like 8 Spartans or something, which is just pure awesomeness. While they cannot be the best, it is nice having troops with shields so I don't need to constantly heal them. The Spartans also serve as frontline distraction, allowing my Marines to focus fire and deal with the threats more efficiently. Similarly to the previous missions, the Covenant also had a super cannon, able to shoot any target at any range, so this was another thing to complicate the mission. Despite the Covenant's best efforts, my forces held strong, and we finished the mission. The next mission was an extremely tough one. Dome of Light introduced a new objective, bringing down the Covenant shield to clear the way for UNSC forces. Forge and the Spartans are on the ground, while Anders is in the research tower helping us take down the shield. There were a few challenges in this mission. First is similar to the Arcadia mission, the player is thrown right into the mess with loads of waves coming shortly after the other. Second is that most missions allow the player an additional base slot, but in this mission there wasn't one. Fortunately, there are various reactors the player can claim to increase their tech level, but still. Lastly, the amount of enemies the player has to deal with is insane, and since we were playing on Legendary, so yeah, this was just a recipe for disaster. I knew going into this mission that this was going to be tough, since from memory, this and a few other missions were much harder than the others, even on the same difficulty. Since we were using skulls, this made things much more manageable, made the playing field a bit more even. The skulls I use range from increasing the supplies coming in to increasing player hit points. Even with all of these skulls, the mission can still feel quite difficult, as showcased previously. The player must go and take control of various locations around the map. There are 5 places total where the player must secure. Unfortunately, the game forces the player to create rhino tanks, which are mission specific. These are what we actually use to take the shield down. Having to balance defending the base in various rhino positions on top of training and upgrading troops was difficult to say the least. It felt like every 30 seconds to a minute a new wave was coming, so I had to constantly be mindful of what was occurring. After placing all 5 rhinos in their designated locations, we shoot at the dome, bringing it down. The mission ends with the player lasering the crap out of the buildings in the dome. This ended up taking nearly an hour to complete and was one of the toughest missions. Though I did not have to restart like some of the previous missions, it was still hard dealing with the constant Covenant forces. Scarab marked a major turning point in the campaign and a significant challenge for this infantry only run. The mission revolves around taking down the Covenant's massive Scarab Walker, a colossal enemy unit that dwarfs anything I've faced so far. Taking this thing down with only infantry was going to be a test of patience and strategy. The tough thing about this mission is that the player is being timed, though it is not being shown. Essentially, the Scarab will periodically shoot the barrier in between the base and itself. At the end, if not defeated, the Scarab will destroy the player's base entirely. The first phase of this mission required building up my troops while fending off against Covenant attacks. The key here was to roll out upgrades and troops as quickly as possible. Second was running around the map and destroying these power nodes. There are 7 power nodes total, and destroying them will make the Scarab's head movement slower with each destroyed. Lastly was the Scarab itself. This was a real challenge. On Legendary, it was relentless, and its main cannon can easily wipe out entire squads. My strategy was to focus fire using the rocket ability as often as possible for extra damage, and also constantly training Marines to supplement the various losses. After a grueling battle, the Scarab finally went down. It was one of the most intense moments of the run so far, requiring careful planning to succeed. With the Scarab destroyed, we continue on our journey. The next mission I was both excited for, yet was scared of the challenges that could come from beyond. In the most recent cutscene, the Arbiter was tasked with abducting Anders and was successful. Now we are tasked with locating and rescuing her while following her transponder signal. While there are still plenty of Covenant forces to deal with, there was a new threat on the horizon. The challenge here was the limited troops and resources at the beginning. At some point, the 3 Spartans we have become familiar with join the fight and help us by coming in from the flank. It was nice actually, since the Spartans don't take any damage, so I let them clear out all the Covenant forces. As we explore throughout the zone, we eventually come across this.
Forge here. I believe teams Echo and India are compromised. Over.
Covenant? I'm not reading any brute signatures.
Not Covenant, sir. Something else. Something worse. Much uglier.
Yep, we have come across the Flood, this parasitic hive mind that takes over organic life. For those familiar with the Halo games, this will be quite obvious, but let me explain for those who don't know. Since we're using troops, basically people, then yeah, they can be infected. This is both super cool to watch, but also devastating for my troops, as it rips away from their health pool and creates an additional enemy. While the animations for the UNSC and Covenant forces are better in the mainline Halo games, I have to say that the Flood feels much more menacing in Halo Wars. Maybe that's a hot take, but it just feels like there's much more variety and power to the Flood in this game. With Flood birds, these massive bear-like things, Flood cannon launchers, and so many others, it just feels much more menacing. Don't get that confused with horror, because especially Halo 3's mission entering the Flood ship, it genuinely feels suspenseful and horror-like. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think Halo Wars makes the Flood more or less menacing than the mainline Halo games? I'm curious to hear your responses. Anyways, I digress. Navigating through, we are tasked with rescuing the squads that have vanished because of the Flood. This is easier said than done, since there are countless Flood units roaming around. Now, there are also side or optional objectives in each mission. I won't talk about each one, but want to mention this specific one since it's pretty damn hilarious. In this mission, there is one where the player can rescue various ODST units that are trapped. When the player rescues them, they are added to their squad and also say some pretty funny lines.
One of them bit me and ran off. Is that bad? Right away. Something's wrong. I feel funny. Right away.
And yeah, I forgot about dealing damage to your own units.
I don't know why I didn't think that was possible.
Going through the level again, we eventually cleared everything and get back to where we were previously. Reaching the base, we escaped with the troops we rescued. The next mission, titled The Flood, was actually a rather simple battle. Essentially, the player needs to destroy this massive flood base that seems to be controlling the rest. There are 4 other mini flood bases that can be destroyed, and when completed, it weakens the big one. This was a fun mission, but was rather simple and easy, so let's move on. The goal of this next mission is to rescue various trap squads. The previous couple of missions was to showcase the flood, a tutorial if you will. This mission, well, let's say it just dials the flood up to 11. Fighting the flood is always a chaotic experience, but when limited to infantry, it becomes a full-on nightmare. Their overwhelming numbers and ability to infect my troops meant I had to constantly focus fire on important targets to ensure success. Starting off, the player is given access to a few tanks, hornets, and infantry troops. Sending the tanks and hornets to their doom, we press on building and upgrading. By this point in the game, we have access to basically every upgrade the game has to offer, I believe, so we will not be able to increase our power beyond this point. This mission was everything that countered my build, and since it was on Legendary, it made things so much harder. There are flood cannon launchers nearly everywhere in the main path and around. These will continually hit your units, but when hitting infantry units a few times, it will release a flood cloud infecting nearby units. Sure, if it just infects them, that would just be a hindrance, but a manageable one. The tough thing is that once troops get infected, it crowds the space. Since the AI aren't as smart moving around compared to the second game, this makes for a really frustrating ordeal. I ended up restarting and failing this mission so many times, trying out different strategies, and was still having an extremely tough time. The larger flood forms like the flood tanks and the abominations were the biggest problem, besides, the flood launchers. On Legendary, these units could tank an incredible amount of damage while dishing out devastating attacks, so it felt like regardless of what strategy I employed, the results would be the same. The tight quarters on the map didn't help either, as it left little room for maneuvering or retreating. I had to rely heavily on my healing powers to keep my units alive. There were several points where I lost entire squads from them getting infected. By the time it was over, hours later, my forces were battered and depleted, just as I was. Fortunately, I'd managed to hold out long enough to complete the mission and evac the remaining troops. This was easily one of, if not the toughest missions of the run, and it left me wondering how much worse things could get in the final stretch of the campaign. Cleansing was one of the most unique missions in the campaign, as it placed the UNSC's Spirit of Fire at the center of the action. The goal was to clear flood infestation from the ship's outer hull using mobile infantry units. With no vehicles allowed, my task was to rely solely on marines and flamethrowers to combat the flood. The flood swarmed the hulls in waves, attacking both my forces and the ship's core systems. The main challenge was balancing not getting overrun and actually building units. Positioning was critical here. Flood range units and abominations could devastate my squads if I wasn't careful, so I had to keep my infantry in strategic locations. Player powers were used frequently to keep players alive and deal as much damage as possible. Fortunately, there are flood units on the side of the ship that can't be fought without air units, so yeah, another mission where the game forces you to use non-infantry units. Repairs continued the battle aboard the Spirit of Fire, this time focusing on protecting the ship's core systems while engineers worked to bring key systems back online. On Legendary, this mission was a brutal test of endurance as the Covenant launched relentless assaults on multiple fronts. The mission started with limited resources, so my first priority was building up a defensive force of Marines to hold the line. We gained access to the final infantry unit, which are the Cyclops, who can repair buildings. The Cyclopses were extremely vulnerable. This forced me to carefully position my infantry to ensure every possible approach was covered. I ended up failing this mission, which then caused me to change strategies. This time I focused purely on training Cyclops to then make the mission go as quickly as possible. I think we had like at least 20 of them or something, maybe like 15. My Spartans were crucial for dealing with the Covenant's heavy armor and to buy time for my other units. The final moments of the mission were a chaotic scramble as the Covenant launched simultaneous attacks in a last-ditch effort to stop the repairs. Careful coordination and use of player powers, I managed to hold out until the engineers finished their work, leading the mission by the skin of my teeth. Beachhead took the fight back to the Covenant as the UNSC launched an all-out assault to establish a foothold on the planet's surface after rescuing Anders. This mission was a return to large-scale battles, with multiple objectives and heavily fortified Covenant defenses to overcome. The first challenge was securing a base while fending off against Covenant attacks. Without vehicles, I had to rely entirely on an infantry to break through enemy fortifications and hold key positions. Marines and flamethrowers were the backbone of my force, while Spartans led the charge against enemy structures and heavy units. Once the base was secured, the mission required us finding and building 3 more bases. On Legendary, the Covenant's bases were brutal, requiring careful planning and coordination to overcome. I used the Marines and ODST abilities and healing powers as often as possible, ensuring my infantry could push through without taking catastrophic losses. The final base was heavily guarded, even more so than the other ones, including another Scarab. This required my forces to focus their fire, a risky move that left the other units vulnerable to other enemies, but was a necessary evil. Despite the challenges, the mission ended in victory, with the UNSC establishing a stronger foothold on the planet. In Reactor, the goal was to relocate the reactor core to the top of the structure. The earlier part of the mission involved defending against Covenant attacks and building up a base. Spartans handled the initial wave of enemies, while I built up the Marines. Once the base was filled with buildings, I began upgrading my forces for the upcoming battles. I ended up taking too long preparing, and the Covenant decided to send a Scarab to my base. Let's just say that, yeah, I was not able to defend against that. Getting back to a similar point in the mission, we push onwards. At the top of the first hill is a Covenant base. This was fairly easy to capture, since by this point we had the ODST upgrade. The Flood were at the midpoint of the ascent, but were a minor hindrance in the grand scheme of things. Near the top of the structure was heavily guarded, with multiple wraiths, hunters, and turret emplacements covering every approach. After a brutal battle, the area was secured, allowing us to transport the reactor core. Before the final mission, the player gets to watch both an awesome yet extremely sad cutscene. As the UNSC prepares the core to explode, the Arbiter and the Covenant forces ambush them. Seeing the Spartans just melt through wave after wave of elites was pure joy, and it felt like I was experiencing the game for the first time again. On the other hand, Forge fights the Arbiter and successfully takes him down. The sad moment is, well, I'll just let you watch rather than me explaining it.
Sir, it's already overheating. I'll have to separate the core and align them manually when they need to blow.
Son, I have a feeling before this is over, we'll need every last Spartan in the fight. I can do this. Report back to the ship.
Good luck, sir. It's been an honor.
The final mission, Escape, was a race against time to flee the collapsing shield world before it was destroyed. This mission was pure chaos, with the Flood and Covenant launching desperate attacks to stop us. One side has the Covenant forces, and the other the Flood. It's actually really cool just looking at the map. The mission began with a frantic push to secure a base and build up a defensive force. The Covenant at first would send wave after wave to my base, so I need to make sure my defensive capabilities were up sooner rather than later, since I'd rather get the Scarab roaming in the middle out of commission as soon as possible. This was easier said than done, and I ended up losing squad after squad. Building up my units, I seized key locations that the Covenant were holding and destroyed as many of their troops as possible. The Flood similarly were relentless, swarming my infantry from every direction. Marines were essential for holding the line, while Spartans provided much needed versatility for dealing with the heavier units. The final objective was actually opening the portal. This requires the player to open interlocks around the map. Unfortunately, I ended up waiting till the last minute for the final interlock and failed the mission. Going back into the mission again, we go through everything we have done up to what was shown previously. The final moments of the mission has us open the last interlock. By the time the crew leaves, Sergeant Forge sacrifices himself and uses the reactor core to cause the planet to explode. The mission was complete, and the UNSC escaped the shield world just in time. This was Halo Wars with infantry only, well, sort of. We learned that not every mission can be done with infantry units, but most of them can be. Even though there was vehicles given, we rarely used them, and ended up sacrificing them fairly early on. So I'd like to think that this was an infantry only run, or at least the closest you can get. I found this to be an extremely difficult challenge, whether that was me not playing the game for a while beforehand, or just the levels themselves. Let me know down below if you'd like me to tackle a similar challenge in Halo Wars 2. I had a blast playing through this game, so let me know down below your feedback on this game. Should I do more, less, or maybe every once in a while? Thank you for coming and watching the video. Try to do something kind for someone today, whether it's a small or large gesture. This is your boy Skilled Fawn, and I'm out.